Welcome, sleepless spirit. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to guide you gently into the shadows of slumber, where dreams take over and worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it as you listen tonight? And if there's a story you've been longing to hear, something spooky, something comforting, tell me. I'm always listening. Now, tuck yourself in. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm blanket. It's time to let go and drift into the story. What if the journey isn't the most hazardous aspect of your road trip? What might be lurking along the way? We're discussing 11 horrifying true stories tonight that will make you reconsider driving alone. These aren't myths, from highways that don't exist on maps to serial killers who pose as hitchhikers. These are first-hand accounts from survivors who narrowly made it. We'll begin with encounters that defy reality and conclude with tales so horrifying that they have left lasting wounds. Others expose the evil that lurks in unexpected places, while others are still unresolved riddles that confound detectives. Before we begin, click the notification bell and subscribe. Our true horror stories are not to be missed. After reading these 11 tales, you may come to the conclusion that your own spooky road trip experiences weren't that innocent. Let's start with our first story, which will alter your perspective on becoming lost. Now let's go to our first tale. Over the previous 5 years, Eleanor had made numerous trips on the route from Denver to Phoenix. She knew the route from Interstate 25 South to Interstate 40 West, as well as her own driveway, because she worked as a pharmaceutical sales representative. Along the route, she was familiar with every truck stop, picturesque vista, and speed trap. That is precisely why the events of that October night in 2019 continue to disturb her sleep and cause her to doubt all of her preconceived notions about reality. The day had begun rather routinely. At 3:30 p.m., Eleanor departed Denver, intending to arrive in Flagstaff by midnight in order to attend a customer meeting early in the morning. It was a clear and crisp day, ideal road conditions for the upcoming long drive. What followed was all the more horrifying because she had traveled this route so many times that she could almost drive it with her eyes closed. All went well via Pueblo and Colorado Springs. In Trinidad, Eleanor pulled over for gas. As usual, she grabbed her energy bar and coffee from the convenience store. They engaged in the usual small talk about the weather and road conditions with the same old man who had been working there for years. By 7:00 p.m., she was entering New Mexico exactly as planned. Things started to seem strange at that point. However, she was unable to pinpoint the exact cause of the issue. Interstate 25's well-known sights appeared to have changed in some way. Somehow, the mountains didn't appear right. In the dying light, not quite the proper color or shape. Perhaps some atmospheric phenomenon was deceiving her senses, she persuaded herself, or it was simply the strange lighting circumstances. She had, after all, traveled this trip in every conceivable weather and lighting scenario. However, she began to notice that the highway markings and signs didn't exactly match her recollection. Despite years of driving this road, she saw exit signs for villages she had never heard of. She initially thought they were merely recent developments or possibly communities. She had somehow missed it on all of her other journeys. But the farther she drove, the more strange the signs seemed. 5 miles until the next exit, Millbrook, read one sign. Millbrook wasn't on Eleanor's typical itinerary, and she had never heard of it. When she looked at her GPS, it showed that she was still heading south on Interstate 25, just as she should have been. However, the surroundings appeared more strange to her. Without the characteristic debris and rock formations that define this section of the New Mexico highway, the terrain appeared flatter than it should be. Then the sign appeared, which made her stomach fell. Greetings from Colorado, 5,280 feet above sea level. Eleanor's heart thumping. She slammed on the brakes and pulled over to the shoulder. This was not feasible. Hours had passed while she drove south. She had spotted the welcome sign, when she had crossed into New Mexico. How on earth was she getting back into Colorado? Additionally, Denver's elevation was 5,280 feet, not the elevation of any border crossing she was aware of. Eleanor picked up her phone to make a call. Anybody. However, there was no signal. Not merely a weak signal, but no signal at all, as though she had driven into a dead zone. She was still located on Interstate 25 in New Mexico, according to her GPS. However, the scenery outside her windshield, it didn't resemble New Mexico at all. Indeed, it appeared to be unlike anything she had ever seen. Even though it was just 8 p.m., the sky had turned an unnerving shade of purple, and the undulating hills were covered in vegetation that seemed to green for the southwest desert. In an attempt to orient herself, she chose to take the next exit, whichever it was. Perhaps she could locate a restaurant or petrol station where she could get directions and learn more about the situation. The exit ramp led to a 2-lane road that, with only a generic services sign indicating what those services may be, curved out into the distance. Something made Eleanor's blood run cold as she drove down the exit ramp. The freeway she had recently left was no longer visible in her rearview mirror. It was gone, as if it had never been, not obscured by hills or trees. After halting the vehicle, she exited and began to walk back toward the location of the on-ramp. No evidence of the freeway she had just left. Only desolate roads stretched in both directions. Then panic struck. Eleanor returned to her car and continued driving in the hopes of discovering a landmark or an explanation that would help her make sense of her situation. It felt like the 2-lane road went on forever, completely level, devoid of slopes or curves. She came across signage for locations that sounded authentic but weren't. Riverside had 2,847 residents for a community that was far from a river. Mountain View was founded in 1892 in a region that had no mountains at all. The most peculiar aspect was how consistent everything seemed. This was not a dream in which everything changed all the time. Everything was still realistic and absolutely steady, but incorrect. The road was kept up nicely. The signs appeared official and worn, as though they had spent years there. Despite being strange, the terrain adhered to all accepted physics and geography laws. Though not the reality she was familiar with, it was reality. After what felt like hours of driving, Eleanor began to notice that she was passing the same locations constantly. A water tower decorated with an enigmatic design, a cluster of 3 billboards promoting companies she had never heard of, and a recognizable red barn. She initially believed them to be merely comparable structures. However, she was forced to face the unachievable reality when she passed the red barn for the 4th time. She was stuck in a loop of some sort. Her biggest cause of worrying was the gasoline gauge. The needle was getting close to empty as she had filled up in Trinidad. Hours ago, under normal conditions, she would have located a gas station. However, there were no petrol stations or other amenities in this area. In spite of the indications, just the never-ending road, the recurring sights, and the increasing realization that she was stuck in something that shouldn't be there promising them. Everything Eleanor could think of she attempted. She tried to go back the way she had come, but the road ahead and the road behind her appeared to be the same. She attempted to take what seemed to be side roads, but all of them returned within a few hundred yards to the main road. She even attempted to drive off-road, but no matter how hard she tried, her automobile would mysteriously steer back onto the tarmac. The time was the most unsettling aspect. Hours passed on her dashboard clock, but when her phone periodically received a signal, it displayed a completely different time. Her phone would occasionally show the time from earlier in the day, and occasionally from the following day, as though time itself had become unstable here. The timestamps on the few text messages that did make it through were equally absurd. Then it ended as abruptly as it had started. Eleanor found herself staring at a familiar scene. She turned a corner that she had walked countless of times before. She recognized the glaring lights of a truck stop, Her phone's GPS pinpointed her precise location on Arizona's Interstate 40, around 200 meters west of the point at which she had taken the unfeasible detour. Her phone indicated that it was 2:30 a.m., indicating that she has been a driver for her last clear recall was more than 6 hours ago. This is what still frightens Eleanor, though. She had barely traveled 127 miles since filling up in Trinidad, based on her odometer. However, she was now 400 meters farther than she should have been on her path. There was no way to do the math. Over the course of several hours, she had managed to drive twice as far. Of her life in a location that was impossible to depict on a map, Eleanor never told anyone about the incident. A story like that, who would believe it? Rather, she tried to investigate comparable situations in the years that followed, discovering sporadic online testimonies from other drivers who recounted remarkably similar experiences with impossibly difficult roads and wasted time. She now knows that these most people don't know how prevalent stories are. People discuss experiences that they know sound crazy in obscure places on the internet. Eleanor continues to commute for work from Denver to Phoenix to this day. She now never travels alone, though, and she has committed every exit, landmark, and mile marker to memory. She's aware that there is a road that leads to both nowhere and everywhere at the same time, just waiting for the next unwary visitor to take that wrong turn and enter the impossible. Let's go on to the second tale. Steve Fishman has always thought of himself as a decent character judge. He had made a lot of trips around the American West by the age of 28. When he felt like it and his gut told him it was safe, he picked up hitchhikers. He took great satisfaction in his ability to read people fast and discern between those who were genuinely in need and others who might be dangerous. He had honed that ability via years of driving across the country, and until that hot July afternoon in 1975, when his instincts would turn out to be disastrously incorrect in ways he wouldn't learn for months, it had never let him down. Like all summer road trips, the day began as usual. Steve was taking the scenic route through Arizona and Colorado on his way from Los Angeles to Denver in his beat-up Volkswagen van. The week before, he had resigned his job at a manufacturing factory to finance what he dubbed his freedom tour across America with his funds. A cooler full of beer, camping supplies, and enough hope to last 1,000 miles were all packed into the van. The midday sun was beating ruthlessly through Steve's windshield somewhere between Flagstaff and the Colorado border when he noticed a man standing next to the road, thumb out. Despite the intense heat, the man, who looked to be in his 30s, had an average height and build and was dressed in faded trousers and a red flannel shirt. Innocent enough, he looked almost youthful with his reddish-brown hair gleaming in the sunlight. Already pleased with his choice to assist a fellow traveler, Steve slowed the van and pulled aside. Steve felt instantly at ease as the man raced up to the passenger door with an appreciative smile. The hitchhiker said, "Thank God," and got into the van. "My name is Red, and I've been out there for 3 hours." Red appeared to be a seasoned hitchhiker as he sat down in the passenger seat with ease. He was soft-spoken, courteous, and truly grateful for the ride. Red revealed, as they turned back onto the highway, that he was attempting to reach Colorado Springs to stay with a friend while he considered his options after his car broke down approximately 50 meters back. The narrative made sense, delivered without displaying any of the anxiety or exaggeration Steve had acquired to hang around with folks who weren't telling the truth. Steve was particularly impressed by Red's apparent normalcy, not merely ordinary, but genuinely enjoyable company. Red had a natural ability to strike up a discussion without being overtly intimate or invasive. He posed intelligent queries regarding Steve's adventures, offered insightful commentary on the terrain they were traversing, and even had a nice sense of humor. Red pulled packages of crackers and beef jerky out of a well-worn rucksack and offered to share some snacks he had purchased at the previous truck stop. When Steve commented that he was a little hungry, Steve discovered that he was actually enjoying Red's company as the miles passed. The hitchhiker appeared to be well read and to have taken a lot of trips across the western United States, from the Oregon woodlands to the Nevada deserts. He delivered captivating tales of the locations he had been. Red was particularly skilled at capturing the little, oddball characteristics that contributed to the uniqueness of each place. The sound of coyotes in some areas, the way morning fog flowed across some mountain passes, and the friendliness or mistrust of the residents in other tiny villages. Red also showed a remarkable understanding of useful travel techniques. He was aware of which highway segments were most likely to have speed traps, which truck stops had the cleanest facilities, and which the greatest balance of safety and scenery could be found in camping locations. Red identified the cause of the odd rattling sound coming from Steve's van as a loose heat shield and demonstrated how to temporarily repair it, using some wire from his back. Steve nearly forgot he was providing a lift to a total stranger because the conversation flowed so smoothly. Red inquired about Steve's background, his future goals, and the reasons behind this specific journey. Red reciprocated by sharing what appeared to be sincere insights about his personal life, his difficulties in obtaining a stable job, his passion for traveling, and his belief in the liberation that accompanies being unbound by a specific location or schedule. Steve had to make a choice as nightfall drew near. Red had intended to drive directly to Denver, but his final destination was Colorado Springs, roughly 1 hour south of that path. Steve immediately offered to drive Red all the way to Colorado Springs, despite the fact that doing so would require him to travel more miles and take longer. Although he was appreciative, Red maintained that he didn't want to force it. The next conversation revealed more of Red's character. He gave off the impression that he truly cared about bothering other people, and graciously declined his offer to donate gas money. The mountains were painted in tones of orange and purple as the sun was sinking when they arrived in Colorado Springs. Red led Steve to a small residential area where he claimed to have a friend. When they arrived to a modest home with a tidy front yard, Red packed up his things and gave Steve a heartfelt thank you for the ride. In an attempt to send a thank you note, he even insisted on writing down Steve's address, which appeared both traditional and sincere. Red said something to Steve that would stay with him 4 years after he got out of the van. "You know," Red replied, directing those cool, perceptive eyes straight at Steve. Steve observed Red approach the front. "You're a good person for picking up strangers. Most people these days are too suspicious, too afraid of everyone they don't know. However, you can tell a lot about someone's character by how they treat people who can't do anything for them in return." Door and knock. A woman responded who seemed to recognize Red, and Steve was pleased that he had managed to get someone safely to their destination. As he drove off, Steve thought about how pleasant the encounter had been. In a world where people frequently warn, the encounter faded into the background of Steve's memory as he continued his travels and eventually returned to a more conventional lifestyle, getting married, starting a family, and settling into a career that required less wandering and more stability. Red had been proof that there were still decent people out there who sometimes just needed a helping hand. When the subject of travel or hitchhiking came up, Steve would use his positive experience with Red as evidence that most people are good at heart if you give them a chance. This cozy belief persisted until March 1976, almost 8 months after their encounter, when Steve was reading the morning newspaper and noticed a headline. As Steve read the article, a cold realization started to sink in. Robert Frederick Carr III, a 31-year-old drifter, had confessed to killing at least 15 people across multiple states between 1974 and 1975. Carr III was a confessed serial killer linked to multiple highway murders. The suspect's moniker, Red Carr, which the media and law enforcement had adopted due to his unusual hair color, was what really chilled Steve. Even if his physical attributes matched those of an average height, build, and reddish-brown hair in his early 30s, he shook as he read on. The article described Carr's strategy. He would hitchhike between states, preying on other hitchhikers, campers, and travelers who stopped to assist him. He was especially notorious for his ability to seem completely normal and trustworthy, spending hours or even days with potential victims before exposing his true identity. According to several survivors, he was articulate, knowledgeable about travel, and had an almost magnetic personality that made people want to help him. Several of Carr's confirmed victims had been discovered along highways in the same areas where Steve had picked up Red, and the dates of some of his attacks fell within days of Steve's encounter with the hitchhiker. The timeline aligned perfectly. The article claimed that Carr had been active during the summer of 1975, traveling extensively through Arizona, Colorado, and surrounding states. One investigator observed that Carr appeared to enjoy psychological manipulation, sometimes spending long periods of time with people who could have become victims, seemingly enjoying the power of knowing he could kill them at any moment, while they remained completely unaware of the danger they were in. Perhaps the most terrifying detail of all was buried deep within the article. Steve realized with increasing horror that he had spent nearly 6 hours alone in a confined space with one of America's most prolific serial killers. Every laugh they had exchanged, every perceptive observation Red had made, every moment of apparent human connection had been taking place as a cunning predator assessed Steve as possible prey. Killers. Reed Robert Frederick Carr III had sat inches away from him, engaging in pleasant conversation and sharing snacks, while presumably deciding whether or not to add Steve to his list of victims, whether it had been a warning, a private joke, or just the thoughts of someone who knew exactly how his victims' compassion and willingness to help strangers had made them vulnerable to him. The fact that Red had specifically commented on Steve's trusting nature took on a sinister new meaning. Steve never found out why Red had decided not to kill him that day. Perhaps Red's plan had been thwarted by Steve's detour to Colorado Springs. The revelation radically altered Steve's perception of human nature and his own judgment. He had prided himself on his ability to read people. Maybe Red had decided that Steve's van was too unique and memorable for a clean getaway. Or maybe, and this is the most unsettling, Red had just been in a good mood and spared Steve's life on a whim. Red had been everything Steve believed a trustworthy person should be: courteous, considerate, intelligent, and appreciative. However, he had spent hours with a serial killer without feeling any danger at all. The knowledge that such outward normalcy could conceal such deep evil made Steve reevaluate all of his presumptions about his capacity to judge others. Red's knowledge of remote camping areas and truck stop routines now seemed like the professional expertise of a predator, and his philosophical remarks about trust and human nature felt like the thoughts of someone who had studied and taken advantage of those very qualities in his victims. 4 years afterward, Steve would wake up in cold sweats, recalling moments from that drive with new insight. At 51, Mark Trump owned a prosperous berry farm in Sylvan, Victoria, which covered more than 400 acres of great agricultural property, approximately an hour east of Melbourne. He never picked up another hitchhiker again. Now, let's move on to our next story. The Trumps looked like a close-knit, hard-working family to their neighbors and business associates, and their family berry operation had been thriving for years, supplying major supermarket chains across Australia with high-quality strawberries and blueberries. Mark worked the land alongside his wife Jacoba, 53, and their 3 adult children, Mitchell, 25, Ella, 22, and Rihanna, 29. But beneath the surface of this perfect life, something had started to go horribly wrong. Mark began complaining to family members about being watched and monitored in the months before August 2016, which at first sounded like relatively small grievances. Jacoba and the kids blamed their worries about feeling like their phones were being tapped or that strangers were asking too many questions about their business operations on the stress of managing a large agricultural operation during a particularly difficult growing season. But during July and early August, Mark's paranoia started to grow significantly, and he became certain that their property was being watched by unidentified. The situation reached a critical point when he began checking and rechecking locks, insisting that family members refrained from using their cell phones, and expressing beliefs that their internet activity was being monitored. What worried the family the most was how these concerns seemed to be spreading to other family members, especially Yokoba, who started echoing Mark's fears about being watched and followed. Mark was certain that remaining at the farm constituted an immediate threat to their safety, but he was never able to specify what that threat was or who might be responsible for it. On August 29, 2016, Mark made the announcement that would forever change his family's life. They had to leave their property right away, leaving behind everything they had spent decades building. The most upsetting of all was his insistence that they not bring any technological equipment with them, including cell phones, GPS units, or credit cards that could be tracked. What transpired next was incomprehensible and illogical. Even while there was no hard proof of any real danger, the whole Trump family decided to forsake their prosperous business and comfortable lifestyle in order to make what Mark called a necessary escape. On the morning of August 30th, 2016, all 5 members of the Trump family got into their silver Peugeot sedan, leaving behind their house, their farm, their staff, and any electronic communication or navigation systems. The family's first destination seemed to be northern New South Wales. The journey started ominously. Yokoba had packed only necessities. The adult children brought few possessions, as if they truly thought they might never return home. Mark had taken out a large sum of money before they left, presumably thinking that using credit cards would enable whoever was allegedly tracking them to find their location. Even though his preparations appeared haphazard and paranoid. As they drove north from Victoria into New South Wales, Mark, who was behind the wheel, became more and more upset. Persuaded that they were being followed, he kept checking his mirrors and made unforeseen turns that prolonged their journey by many hours. Mark's paranoia seemed to get more intense with every mile, and the family members later recalled the mood in the car as tight and terrifying. When they arrived at Borst, about 200 kilometres west of Sydney, in South Wales, the psychological strain had become unbearable. Throughout the journey, Yokoba had been supporting her husband's anxieties, but all of a sudden, she had what can only be described as a full mental breakdown. She abruptly got out of the car and started sprinting around Borst streets, clearly distressed and disoriented. Locals discovered Yokoba aimlessly wandering around, unable to identify her or the reason for her presence. She seemed confused and afraid, talking ramblingly about dangers and threats that only she could see. Local police were approached by worried citizens, and they promptly concluded that Yokoba was going through a psychological crisis. After being brought to Borst Hospital for assessment and care, she became the first member of the family to be taken out of the group. Although Yokoba's departure appeared to hasten the psychological decline of the surviving family members, Mark and the 3 adult children carried on with their journey without her. The youngest son, Mitchell, later talked of feeling torn between wanting to support his father, who was clearly in misery, and seeing that things were getting totally out of hand. Mitchell was the next member of the family to leave the group. Mitchell had to decide to end the family's increasingly illogical excursion somewhere between Borst and their next stop. Mitchell's departure was more planned than his mother's spectacular breakdown. He eventually headed back toward Melbourne, contacting people who could assist him. However, he would eventually need professional treatment to deal with the trauma of seeing his family's psychological collapse. Mark and his 2 children, Ella and Rihanna, were left to continue their increasingly desperate and aimless escape from fictitious assailants. As Mark's paranoia escalated, his driving became increasingly unpredictable. He started taking increasingly isolated roads through rural New South Wales in an effort to evade detection, since he was certain that every car following them was a part of a complex monitoring operation. Mark's oldest daughter, Rihanna, was the most unsettling victim of the psychic infection that had afflicted the family. Rihanna started displaying symptoms of extreme dissociation and reality distortion as they traveled further, surpassing even her father's paranoid illusions. She began to express views that she was no longer herself, that the same forces her father thought were after them had somehow stolen or damaged her identity. When they arrived in the town of Yos, things became dire. About 280 kilometers southwest of Sydney, Rihanna's mental health had gotten so bad that she was unable to tell the difference between her inner demons and the outside world. In an incident that would never be forgotten by the family, Rihanna abruptly got out of the car and started running in the direction of a local train station, seemingly thinking that getting on a train would help her break free from whatever mental prison she was in. Unfortunately, Rihanna was running toward the train station when she was hit and killed by a truck. Her passing was the final result of the widespread psychological collapse that had engulfed the Trump family, changing the irrational paranoia of a prosperous farming family turned into a terrible tragedy that would haunt all of the survivors for life. Later that day, police discovered Mark and Ella in very serious psychological anguish, now reduced to just the two of them. For their own protection, both were placed under arrest and given prompt mental health assessment and treatment. Mark seems to have lost all sense of reality. Ella was a little more coherent, but she was obviously devastated by seeing her family fall apart and her sister die, and she was unable to explain why they had left their farm or what they had been fleeing from. The ensuing inquiry found absolutely no proof of any real dangers to the Trump family. Police investigated their financial status, personal communications, company documents, and property in detail. On their property, no surveillance equipment was discovered. There were no threatening communications found. The family was not of interest to any government authorities or criminal organizations. Their company was both legally compliant and financially stable. The concerns that had compelled them to forsake everything and set out on their terrible journey simply had no logical explanation. Travel. The surviving family members were tested by mental health doctors who made a diagnosis of what seemed to be folia, or shared psychotic disease, but in this instance, impacting several family members at once. This uncommon disorder develops when a person's paranoid ideas and delusions spread to those who are close to them, especially in close-knit groups like families. The strain of managing a Mark's underlying psychological vulnerabilities and the demanding nature of his agricultural company seemed to have set off an initial paranoid episode, which spread to other family members through their regular encounters and strong emotional attachments. The Trump family tragedy served as a case study for how shared delusions may have disastrous real-world repercussions and how mental illness can propagate through family structures. Mitchell needed months of treatment because he had broken up with the family early in their adventure, deal with his remorse at not being able to stop the catastrophe, to heal from the trauma of seeing her sister die and her family fall apart. Ella required even more intensive care. After spending a significant amount of time in mental health facilities, Mark eventually recovered enough to comprehend the gravity of what had happened. After being admitted to the hospital first, Yokoba finally regained her mental stability, although she was left to struggle with her family's devastation and the terrible loss of her daughter. The family was unable to return to the location where their common illusions had originally taken root. Thus the berry farm, which had once been a source of pride and riches, was eventually sold. One of the most unsettling instances of how psychological contagion can turn a typical family into fugitives from made-up threats and finally result in actual, irrevocable disaster is the Trump family case. Their tale serves as a terrible reminder that sometimes the most terrifying foes are those that only exist in our own minds, and that the human mind's ability for self-deception can be more harmful than any external threat. Let's go on to the fourth tale. Jennifer Walsh has always driven cautiously, the type of person who, if at all possible, never drove on new roads after dark, kept her gas tank full, and planned her trips ahead of time. She spent a lot of time driving between hospitals and clinics throughout the remote areas of Northern California in her role as a regional sales manager for a medical supply firm. At the age of 34, she needed to be pragmatic for her profession, professional and perceptive, traits that had benefited her in both her personal and professional life. Jennifer was coming from what should have been a standard client visit in the little town of Willits, which is located roughly 3 hours north of San Francisco. On this specific Tuesday night in September 2018, she intended to finish the drive back to her Paloma house throughout the day. However, the hospital administrator's insistence on a thorough tour of their new cardiac wing caused her last session to go longer than anticipated. The sun had already fallen behind the coastal mountains when she wrapped up her presentation and put her sample bags back into her Honda Accord. Jennifer had to make a decision that many women, in particular, must make while traveling alone. Choose the quicker but more remote path through the wilderness, or adhere to the major routes, even if the travel takes a lot longer. Although Highway 101 would prolong her trip by almost an hour, it provided the security of steady traffic, brightly lit truck stops, and mobile phone coverage. Although the Anderson Valley's back roads would significantly reduce her trip time, they wound through miles of untouched woodland, leaving her stuck until dawn in the event of a breakdown. It was fatigue that decided for her. Jennifer had a 6 to start the day, and then appointments in 3 different places after a client meeting in Eureka. She had been traveling for more than 10 hours, getting by on energy bars and coffee from convenience stores. She had an early morning meeting in San Rafael the next day, so the idea of making the drive an additional hour was overwhelming. Jennifer, against her better judgment, made the decision to bypass the mountains. The path started off harmlessly enough. The well-kept two-lane State Route 253 west from Ukiah connects a number of minor Anderson Valley villages. Jennifer had previously traveled this road in the daytime and recalled it as picturesque but unimpressive. Passing the occasional vineyard or rural residence as it winds through redwood forests, she found her driving rhythm amid the mountains, her headlights piercing the deepening darkness. Driving carefully around curves and keeping an eye out for any deer or other wildlife that might stray into the road. Everything went according to plan for the first 45 minutes. Before heading back to the remote darkness of the forest road, Jennifer traveled through the little towns of Boonville and Faux, where the few streetlights offered a moment's comfort. There were 2 bars of signal strength on her phone, which was sufficient for emergency use. Despite the challenging mountain terrain, her car was operating properly, and the fuel gauge showed she had enough gas to get to Paloma. A little after 9:00 p.m., when Jennifer saw headlights coming up behind her. This was not exceptional in and of itself. This was a common path for other passengers, and she had already passed a number of cars going the other way. She noticed the speed at which the car was closing in on her, perhaps 5 miles per hour less than the posted limit to compensate for the darkness and unknown turns. Jennifer was driving at an acceptable speed for the road conditions. The car that was approaching appeared to be moving much more quickly, and her rearview mirror showed the headlights getting bigger at a frightening rate. In order to give the other motorist a safe pass, Jennifer's immediate inclination was to slow down and go as far to the right as she could. Rather than a cautious out-of-town visitor, she figured it was most likely a local who knew the road well and was at ease driving faster. She anticipated seeing the other cars swing onto the road as she slowed down and embraced the right side of the road, left lane and pass her when it's safe to do so. Instead, the car slowed to keep up with her decreased speed, staying just behind her. It looked like a pickup truck or SUV, and Jennifer could see in her mirrors that it was riding high enough that its headlights were almost level with her rear window, perhaps because the lights were so brilliant altered with aftermarket bulbs that appeared to be made to dazzle oncoming traffic. Jennifer was particularly troubled by the car's intentional actions. The motorist appeared to be staying behind her, even though it was obviously capable of passing her. Jennifer attempted to make sense of the circumstance. It's possible that the other motorist was use her vehicle as a guide through the challenging terrain, because she was also unfamiliar with the road. Perhaps they were waiting for a longer, straighter section, because they were being careful about passing on the winding mountain roads. She reminded herself that she was probably exaggerating, allowing her exhaustion and the remote location to cause needless worrying about what was probably just a coincidental incident. However, Jennifer's uneasiness grew as the miles went by. Despite the difficult driving circumstances, the car behind her kept an uncomfortable following distance, never more than a few car lengths distant. The other motorist also slowed when Jennifer slowed for especially steep turns. The car behind her precisely matched her pace when she accelerated on straightaways. Most disturbingly, even when they came across lengthy, straight stretches of highway with unobstructed view and no oncoming traffic, the truck did not try to pass. Jennifer attempted a number of nuanced tests to determine the other driver's motivations, in the hopes that the other vehicle would grow impatient and pass her. She purposefully slowed down to well below the speed limit. Rather, the truck slowed to keep up with her. At one point, she seemed to be inspecting something with her car by pulling partially onto the shoulder, but the truck just stopped and waited behind her. It continued to follow at the same uncomfortable close distance. When she took the wheel again, Jennifer could feel her heart rate rising by this point, and her hands were firmly holding the driving wheel. She had a gut feeling that this was not typical driving conduct. She couldn't conceive of any legitimate reason for such continuous tailgating on a remote mountain road late at night, and the motorist behind her was purposefully following her around. When Jennifer climbed a short hill and ended up on an unusually long, straight length of highway, the situation took a sharp turn for the worst. She could see orange cones positioned across both lanes of traffic and what looked like road construction signs in the distance. But when she got closer, something about the scene seemed off to her. There were no people or equipment in the construction zone, giving the impression that it was unattended. More significantly, the work area was not properly marked with warning signs or official vehicles. In an attempt to have a better understanding of the situation, Jennifer slowed down and activated her hazard lights. Her blood ran cold at what she witnessed. What looked to be a spike strip, a tool commonly employed by law enforcement to damage the tires of evading cars, was stretched across the road. The orange cones prevented any vehicle from avoiding the strip, which was positioned so that any vehicle would have to travel over it. However, this was not a checkpoint for the police. No uniformed officers, no squad cars, no formal barricades, and no signage were present. Only the spike strip and cones placed such that, in the dark, they appear to be real road work. With increasing terror, Jennifer recognized that this was a trap designed to disable cars and leave their occupants trapped in this remote area as her headlights became more visible. Jennifer's thoughts were racing as she attempted to comprehend the situation. Now, the car that had been pursuing her was right behind her, its high-beam headlights illuminating her car. She heard the truck's engine revving, as though it were ready to thwart any attempt by her to turn around or reverse, but she was unable to see who was inside. The moment was too ideal to be a coincidence. She had been aching her way toward this trap, being led into the ambush by the headlights of her own car. Jennifer had only a few seconds to act before she fell prey to whatever these individuals had planned. She thought in that horrifying epiphany. About 50 yards in front of us was the spike strip. Even if she slammed on her brakes right away, she wouldn't be able to stop safely on the wet mountain road. The truck behind her was speeding, as if it would crash her over the spikes if she attempted to stop. In an instant, Jennifer made a choice that most likely saved her life. She slammed the pedal and pointed her vehicle straight for the space between two orange cones on the right, avoiding a collision or attempting to turn around. By the side of the road, her Honda tore through the underbrush next to the highway and crashed through the temporary barrier, bottoming out as it left the tarmac. Jennifer struggled to keep her car under control. It bounced and scratched around fallen branches and pebbles, the tires still intact, but the undercarriage suffering damage. The truck that had been following her skid to a stop next to the spike strip was visible in Jennifer's rearview mirror. She was already too far away to make out specifics, but two figures came out of the car, one of them seeming to yell angrily at her. With her foot on the pedal, Jennifer smashed through bushes and tiny trees until she came to what seemed like an abandoned logging road that ran back toward the main highway. Jennifer drove cautiously off-road for about 20 minutes to return to pavement. Coming out, she turned off Route 253 and headed south a few miles to Highway 101. Although damaged, her car was still operational. After the violent journey through the bush, its bumpers were dented and its paint was scratched. Above all, she was free and living, after escaping what she now realized had been a well-planned ambush by individuals with an identified but unquestionably malevolent intent. Jennifer drove straight to the closest police station and reported the incident to officers. They took her account seriously, but acknowledged that they were only partially able to investigate without more detailed information about the suspects' locations or descriptions. Jennifer had been unable to obtain information that could have resulted in arrests because of the isolated location, the darkness, and her natural desire to flee. Jennifer discovered in the days that followed that she wasn't the first to notice strange activities along the highway segment, though none had come as close as Jennifer to being caught by the spike strip. Several cars had reported being followed or running into strange barriers. Police hypothesized that she had come across a robbery crew that targeted lone passengers on the remote route, disabled their vehicles, and robbed them in an area where victims would not likely be able to get assistance soon. Jennifer chose not to give it much thought and was never told what might have happened to her if she hadn't escaped. Her perspective on travel, especially while traveling alone and at night, was drastically altered by the experience. She changed her work schedule to avoid late-night travel, upgraded her emergency communication gear, and never again took shortcuts through isolated locations without telling someone her precise route and anticipated arrival time. Above all, Jennifer discovered how to fully trust her intuition. Just enough notice was given to save her life by the subliminal cues that warned her of danger. The odd conduct that followed, the suspicious timing, and the poorly marked construction zone. She frequently pondered the number of other passengers who had fallen victim to similar traps on desolate roads, and the proportion of those who were not as fortunate to detect and flee the danger in time. Let's go on to the fifth tale. To get to her sister's wedding in Phoenix before the rehearsal supper, Hazel had traveled through 3 states in 12 hours, going above and beyond her usual comfort zone. Unexpected construction delays had complicated what should have been a simple 8-hour drive from her Denver home. A young person, her own obstinate unwillingness to stop for appropriate rest breaks, and the fender bender that necessitated a 2-hour wait for police reports. 500 a.m. She knew she had to stop for at least a brief rest before going on the last stretch to Arizona, since fatigue was causing her eyelids to become heavy. The remainder in the darkness before dawn. The station she selected seemed inconspicuous, a typical state facility, complete with facilities, vending machines, and the typical concrete structure housing, with a modest parking lot and a few picnic tables. In fact, Hazel liked that the venue was completely empty at this early hour. As a woman traveling alone, she had always felt a little uneasy at crowded rest stations, so being by herself allowed her to use the facilities and stretch her legs without worrying about safety or interacting with strangers. After parking her silver Camry close to the restroom facility, Hazel took a seat for a while, allowing the engine to run while she collected her belongings. There was a tremendous quiet. There was only the soft hum of her car's motor and the distant tweeting of early morning birds. No interstate traffic noise, no sounds of other travelers. She could afford to take a 10-minute break to splash some water because, according to her phone, she had almost 2 hours of driving left before arriving in Phoenix. Get a coffee from the vending machine and put a smile on her face. After spending hours in the stuffy cabin of her car, Hazel was relieved to feel the cold desert air against her skin. She got out. Out of habit, she locked the car, even though it didn't seem essential in such a remote place, and proceeded to the restroom structure. The lights from the motion sensor flared on. She came closer, lighting the concrete building and creating harsh shadows that added to the bleak appearance of the vacant parking lot. The women's room was just what she had anticipated. Fluorescent lights, institutional tile floors, and the antiseptic odor of industrial cleaning supplies combined with the general mustiness that seemed to pervade all public spaces. Although the strong lighting made her appear unclean, Hazel was relieved to discover it comparatively clean and well maintained. In the mirror over the sinks, pallid and worn out, she took a time to stretch her back, which hurt from the long hours of driving, and splashed cold water in her face and through her hair. Hazel initially became aware that something was off. She was getting ready to leave the bathroom. Through the small ventilation window near the ceiling, she caught a sight of moving outside in the parking lot. Beside her automobile, someone was crouching. She couldn't see exactly what they were doing, though, from her vantage point inside the bathroom. At first, she assumed maybe another traveler had arrived and was experiencing car difficulty. However, she hesitated because of the figure's fervent movements. Hazel tried to obtain a better view without showing herself by pressing herself against the wall underneath the window. She was so terrified by what she witnessed that her stomach dropped. On his back, a man dressed in black attire appeared to have fallen beneath her vehicle. This individual wasn't looking for assistance or addressing issues with their own car. This was someone who purposefully concealed behind her car so she wouldn't be able to see him when she got back. Hazel was immediately struck by the ramifications. Even if his intentions weren't immediately violent, the man would be just underneath her car when she walked back to it, perhaps planning to seize her legs or ankles. When she got to the driver's door, she would be totally exposed to whatever he had in store for her if she were dragged to the ground in this remote place. His strategic placement indicated that this was no chance meeting. He was lying in wait like a predator and had picked out her automobile carefully. When Hazel comprehended the full extent of her situation, her hands started to quiver. There were no other travelers nearby to assist her, so she was by alone at a remote rest area. Although she had her car keys in her pocket, getting to her automobile would mean crossing the area whether the man was in hiding. He would have the edge of surprise and could easily seize her before she could unlock the door and enter her car. Even if she fled in that direction, she immediately wanted to call for assistance. However, she found she had no cell signal when she took out her phone. The isolated spot that had appeared tranquil only minutes before was now a trap, preventing her from calling for help. With a predator waiting outside and no way out other than to face him head-on, she was totally alone. Hazel's panic overcame her, and she forced herself to think logically. She couldn't remain in the bathroom indefinitely. The male might eventually decide to come look for her after realizing she wasn't coming out. Since there was only one entry to the structure, he could simply imprison her inside if he so desired. The only edge she had was that he was unlikely to have realized she had seen him, which, if she could use it to her advantage, might provide a moment of surprise. Hazel struggled with indecision for several minutes before hearing the sound that made her worrying transform into sheer terror. Footsteps reverberated off the tile walls as the restroom building's massive outside door cracked open. Given the situation, she had no reason to suspect that the man who had been hidden behind her car was the only person who had entered the premises. A male voice yelled out, "Hello," in a tone so phony that it made Hazel's skin crawl. The voice had an oily quality that suggested its owner was enjoying this game of cat and mouse, and Hazel remained perfectly silent as she pressed herself against the wall in the restroom corner farthest from the entrance. "Is anyone in here? I saw a car outside and wanted to make sure everything was okay." The footsteps approached, and Hazel could hear the man methodically inspecting each stall in the bathroom. He knew she was in here because her car was parked right outside, and there was nowhere else she could have gone. But he was playing the part of a worried Good Samaritan instead of admitting his predatory behavior. "I know you're in here," the voice said, shedding the pretense of friendliness. "I saw you go in and I didn't see you come out." The sound of stalled doors being pushed open reverberated through the tiled space, each one bringing him closer to her hiding place, and she realized with increasing horror that the women's restroom had only 6 stalls, and he was methodically working his way down the line toward where she was trapped. There is no reason to hide. Until we get a chance to speak, I won't be leaving. A pair of men's boots materialized beneath the door of the stall adjacent to where Hazel was hiding, and she watched in horror. Now that she could hear his breathing, she knew the man was likely searching beneath each stall door to find her precise location. He would arrive at her stall in a matter of seconds, and her hiding location would be found. Hazel's clarity came suddenly from desperation. She understood that she had to take action before he could find her. Waiting for him to discover her would leave her alone in the cramped bathroom stall, unable to move or protect herself. However, if she could surprise him, she might be able to push past him and make it to the exit while he was still looking. In order to frighten and confuse her stalker, Hazel inhaled deeply, mustered all her courage, and exploded out of her hiding place with a loud scream. She hurried for the exit, startling the man who had been hunched over peering beneath stopped doors. He lost his balance and was unable to stop her in time for a critical moment. Hazel's attempt to flee, however, was only partially successful. She felt the man's fingers seize the back of her jacket as she arrived at the bathroom entrance, turning her around and slamming her into the concrete wall next to the door. For the first time, she was confronted by her assailant, a middle-aged man with wild eyes and disheveled hair that suggested he was either severely mentally ill or a drug user. He growled and tightened his hold on her jacket, asking, "Where do you think you're going? Our conversation is far from over." Hazel was aware that this was probably her last opportunity to get away. Her odds of survival would drastically decrease once he got her away from the building door. Using all of her power and adrenaline, she drove her knee upward as hard as she could, making the man double over in pain as it connected with his crotch. She pulled free from her jacket's hold and ran for the door. She heard the man behind her swearing and starting to chase. However, the injuries had caused him to slow down sufficiently, which gave her a significant advantage. Fumbling for her keys, Hazel rushed for her car after bursting through the outer door. She was relieved to notice that the man was no longer beneath the car. He had apparently given up on that stance when he chose to follow her into the bathroom. As the man emerged from the restroom building, still advancing cautiously, but obviously determined to continue his pursuit, Hazel arrived at her car and successfully unlocked it. In one smooth motion, she jumped into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and turned on the engine before pulling out of the parking spot before her assailant could get to the car. Hazel saw the man in her rearview mirror, waiting in the parking lot, watching her make her getaway as she drove away from the rest stop. One of the most lovely things she had ever seen was the way he shrank away in the distance, signifying her release from what may have been a deadly confrontation. After driving straight to the next town, Hazel discovered a police station and reported the event. Her testimony was taken seriously by the officers, who pledged to look into the rest stop. However, they cautioned her that prosecution would be challenging in the absence of a license plate number or a more detailed description of the suspect. They said that comparable occurrences had been documented at isolated rest areas across the area, indicating that her assailant may be a part of a predatory trend that preys on lone travelers. Hazel's perspective on travel safety was drastically altered by the encounter. She never again paused at remote rest stops, especially in the early morning or late evening when there were few other passengers. She constantly kept family members updated on her precise travel itinerary and anticipated arrival times. And she made an investment in improved emergency communication technology. Above all, she discovered how to fully trust her intuition. Every warning sign in her head had been going off the moment she saw the man lurking beneath her car, and she most likely would have survived if she had heeded those warnings. After several hours, Hazel finally arrived for her sister's wedding. "I'm thankful to be alive despite being late." She didn't want to ruin the party by telling her family the whole reason for her delay. However, the memory of that frightening experience remained with her forever, serving as a constant warning that predators frequently prey on their prey when they are most vulnerable, exhausted, isolated, and distant from assistance. Her escape had required as much quick thinking and willpower as it had good fortune. She was also aware that not all women in comparable circumstances would be lucky enough to escape. Let's go on to the sixth tale. James had been a truck driver for more than 20 years, traveling millions of miles on American highways and witnessing almost everything that a professional driver could encounter. At 53, he had weathered blizzards that caused interstates to become parking lots, avoided collisions with hostile drivers who appeared intent on playing chicken with 18-wheelers, and saw incidents that would plague him for months. He saw himself as a pragmatic individual, someone who dealt not with ghost stories or superstitions, but with tangible facts like dot laws, delivery timetables, and fuel efficiency. Consequently, what transpired on the early morning of March 15, 2017, James's assumptions about the logical, predictable world he had spent decades navigating were put to the test on Highway 87 in Arizona, carrying a load of construction equipment that was to be delivered before the work crews arrived. At 8 a.m. was the start of the typical transport from Phoenix to Flagstaff. Highway 87 through the Sonoran Desert was as familiar to James as he was to the many times he had driven it. He's his own driveway. 4 miles ahead, the highway ran in a straight line, slicing through a starkly beautiful but strangely alien landscape. With their arms lifted in unwavering submission to the harsh embrace of the desert, towering saguaro cactus stood like motionless sentinels against the starry sky. 3:30 a.m. As was typical for this section of road at this hour, James was the only car in sight in either direction. In fact, the seclusion was better. There were no construction zones to slow him down, no four-wheelers swerving erratically between lanes, only the steady beat of his diesel engine and the mesmerizing yellow lines vanishing under his headlights. James had 6 months prior. He had installed a dashcam system, in part for insurance purposes and in part because his employer mandated that all drivers have video proof of their origins. Everything was filmed in high definition by the camera through his windshield, immediately recording any time the truck sensors picked up any unexpected vibrations or abrupt brakes. It was a useful investment that James hardly ever considered, just a result of the current trucking industry's focus on liability protection and documentation. At mile marker 247, roughly 30 meters south of Flagstaff, the first indication that something strange was occurring appeared. James saw what seemed like a human being strolling along the highway shoulder, heading in the same direction as his truck, but going more slowly, like someone taking an evening walk, than someone attending to a roadside issue. This wasn't really new in and of itself. James had come across hitchhikers, stranded drivers, and even the odd inebriated college student who had strayed from a party. But as soon as he saw this creature in his headlights, he thought it was strange. The individual, who might have been a lady or child, seemed diminutive in stature and was dressed in a light-colored gown or frock that seemed to float in the desert wind. It seemed odd that the figure was walking right on the white line that delineated the shoulder of the highway, staying perfectly balanced in spite of the small space, and that James' enormous truck was coming up behind, its headlights lighting up the whole area. As was customary when he saw someone walking close to the road, James slowed his vehicle and shifted into the left lane to allow the pedestrian plenty of space. But as he got closer, he started to observe details that made it difficult for his logical thinking to comprehend what he was witnessing. The figure seemed translucent, as though he could see through the individual to the desert outside. The attire appeared to be from a whole different time period. It was more elegant and vintage rather than the casual attire of a stranded driver. The figure's actions were the most unsettling of all. Despite a huge vehicle approaching, the guy displayed absolutely no awareness of the car. Even with its headlights blazing and the roaring diesel engine that reverberated 4 miles in the desert solitude, there was no acknowledgement that tons of steel and machinery were passing by at 65 miles per hour. No turning to look, and no moving farther away from the road. After he passed The figure kept up the same steady pace and enigmatic disregard for its surroundings, and James observed in his mirrors as it continued to stroll. In order to warn other cars who could be on this path, he reached for his CB radio. However, there was so much static on the radio that it was difficult to communicate. There was no signal even on his cell phone, which was uncommon but not unheard of in some of the most isolated sections of the Arizona highway. James was more troubled by the incident than he cared to acknowledge. He had witnessed many things in his 20 years of truck driving that were difficult to explain. Strange animal behavior, unexplained lights in the sky, and seemingly random weather phenomena. However, he had always been able to explain these experiences or write them off as the result of eye strain, exhaustion, or the mind's propensity to make up patterns when none existed. It felt strange. The figure he had passed was too obvious, too specific, and too hard to explain. James made an effort to forget about the situation and concentrate on driving, but the odd pedestrian kept coming back into his mind. What disturbed him most about the figure was its translucent nature. He had persuaded himself that it had to be a lighting trick, maybe brought on by the way his headlights struck the dust on the road or the shimmer of the desert heat. However, he understood in his heart what he had witnessed, and it contradicted his basic conception of reality. 4 miles down the roadway, at mile marker 251, James came across the figure once more. What he saw this time could hardly be mistaken. Walking along the shoulder in the same way as before was the same translucent individual dressed in period attire. James realized instantly that the scenario was impossible. If the figure had actually been a person, there would have been no way in the short minutes that had passed since his truck passed them. They may have traveled 4 miles. While trying to figure out what was going on, James stopped and pulled his truck over to the shoulder, leaving his hazard lights flashing. He got out of his taxi and turned to face the highway again. But the man was gone. There was nowhere to hide, even if one had wanted to, because the desert was deserted in every direction. The only sounds to break the utter quiet were the cooling engine of his truck ticking and the sound of wind blowing through the saguaro cacti in the distance. James climbed back into his taxi and looked to see if the interaction had been captured on his dashcam system. He would live with the consequences of what he discovered on the video. Everything had been captured in pristine detail by the camera. The walking transparent figure along the shoulder, the vintage attire, and even the way the individual appeared to float rather than move normally. The most unsettling aspect, though, was a detail James had missed while driving. Even though his truck's strong headlights were shining on the person, there was no shadow on the pavement. The video's timing verified James' recollection of the interaction, eliminating any chance that exhaustion, or he had imagined or distorted what he had seen due to highway hypnosis. A neutral electronic witness, the dash cam had captured an incident that defied both human experience and the fundamental principles of physics. James drove on to Flagstaff, but the rest of the way was a blur of uncertainty and bewilderment. He finished the required papers and delivered his load on time, but his thoughts kept going back to the recorded by his dashcam. He showed the footage to other truck drivers, mechanics, and even his dispatcher over the course of the next few days in the hopes that someone would offer a logical explanation for what the camera had caught. The responses were disturbing and constant. Everybody who watched the video concurred that it revealed something remarkable and inexplicable. Some claimed that there were optical illusions or technical issues, but the precision and coherence of the such justifications appeared insufficient due to the recording. Others reported similar experiences they had heard from truckers who operated the routes in Arizona, tales that had been written off as the work of sleep-deprived minds or highway legends. James started looking up the history of Highway 87 and the desert region around it, since he was curious about where he had seen the figure. His encounter was made even more mysterious by what he found. He had witnessed the translucent figure travel over a section of highway that had seen many deadly collisions over the years. Numerous incidents involved individuals who had strayed onto the road for unclear reasons. Drivers have been reporting such encounters for decades, according to local newspaper archives. Transparent figures are seen driving down the highway, consistently in the same general vicinity, and consistently showing the same lack of concern for oncoming vehicles. Authorities had rejected the majority of these allegations as the result of attention-seeking behavior, optical illusions, or exhaustion. However, James' high-definition video evidence and the description's consistency pointed to a more significant event. The majority of James made the horrifying revelation that the present Highway 87 was constructed over an ancient desert path that had been traversed by travelers for many years. According to historical documents he discovered, this road has seen a number of fatalities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, including the discovery of a young woman's body next to the trail in 1897. She had been wearing a light-colored clothing and seemed to have been traveling across the desert by herself when she passed away from exposure and exhaustion. According to reports in the newspapers at the time, on later journeys along Highway 87, James never saw the figure again. However, every time he traveled that route, he found himself keeping an eye out for it. After being circulated at truck stops and posted on social media sites devoted to paranormal encounters, the dash cam movie became something of a legend among truckers who operate in the Southwest. Some viewers were unconvinced and offered complex technical justifications for the images the camera had obtained. Others interpreted it as evidence that the lines separating the physical and spiritual worlds were more tenuous than most people thought. James' understanding of the nature of reality and the potential for consciousness to endure physical death was drastically altered by the encounter. He had always been a pragmatic individual who worked with quantifiable events and observable facts. However, the collision on Highway 87 compelled him to admit that there may be facets of life that are beyond the realm of accepted knowledge. James continues to drive trucks on American highways years later, but he is now more conscious of the mysteries that could be hiding just out of his headlights. He has discovered that there are more hidden mysteries on the road than just traffic patterns and fuel usage. The clear and blinking eye of a dashboard camera, capturing something that shouldn't exist, can sometimes provide more convincing evidence for the impossible than urban legends or ghost stories. The video is still as distinct and unsettling as the day it was captured, a digital record of an experience that questions all we believe to be true about life, death, and the tenuous points where the two worlds might occasionally meet on a desolate desert roadway the dark of the early morning. Let's proceed to the eighth tale. Paul Henricks was a long-distance driver, Midwest Express freight routes for more than 15 years. He had also witnessed enough roadkill over that period to fill a small cemetery. Dogs, cats, possums, raccoons, and deer. The American highway system served as a cemetery for animals that were unable to adjust to the fact that their native habitats were being destroyed by fast-moving vehicles. Paul had honed his ability to recognize various animal remains as a professional driver who spent 3 weeks of every month on the road. This was primarily due to practical necessity, as it prevented tire damage and ensured safe following distances. What he found on Interstate 90 close to the Montana-North Dakota border was quite unsettling because of this incident. On November 12, 2019, Paul had been traveling east through the pre-dawn darkness while transporting a cargo of farm equipment from Spokane to Minneapolis. The highway surfaces were sufficiently slick to necessitate extra caution due to the clear but chilly weather, with temperatures hanging just around freezing and a light frost. Roughly at 4:45 a.m., about 200 yards in the right lane, Paul's headlights spotted what seemed like a sizable piece of roadkill. His first thought was that, given its size and overall form, it was most likely a deer that had been hit by a previous car and abandoned it on the road. On this section of road, which went through regions with sizable deer populations that frequently crossed the highway during their seasonal migrations, this was not an uncommon sight. Paul started following the customary procedure when he came across roadkill, which involves looking in his mirrors for oncoming traffic, signaling a lane change to the left, and lowering his speed a little to make sure he could avoid the blockage safely. But when he approached, and the site was better illuminated by headlights, and as details emerged, he became more uneasy about what he was witnessing. For a deer or any other huge animal, Paul knew, the shape was incorrect, without the characteristic head and limbs that one would anticipate from wildlife. It seemed to be roughly cylindrical. It was also uncommon in color, as opposed to local wildlife's usual fur colors of brown, gray, or tan. In the glow of his headlights, this thing looked pallid, almost flesh-cold. The size, which appeared too big for most creatures, but too little for an elk or moose, was the most unsettling aspect of all. Paul had learned from his years of expertise he should exercise caution when near roadkill for a number of pragmatic reasons. If fresh carcasses included rough elements like antlers or hooves that may harm tires, they could still be dangerous. Scavengers may occasionally dart into traffic because of older remains. However, there was something about this specific scene that set off feelings that beyond professional prudence and turned into actual discomfort. Paul shifted to the left, leaned, and started to go by the impediment. His headlights gave him a sharp view that will stay with him forever. Instead of an animal, what was lying in the road was what looked like a human torso, headless, limbless, and carefully dismembered in a manner that suggested intentional butchery other than the hap has a trauma of a car crash. The torso appeared to have been meticulously placed lengthwise in the roadway, positioned there as opposed to being dropped by accident. Clean, straight edges that appeared surgical in their accuracy were visible at the severing sites where the head and limbs had been severed. Surprisingly little blood was evident on the concrete surrounding the remains, indicating that either the torso had been transferred to this area after the dissection took place elsewhere, or that a considerable amount of time had elapsed since the initial injury. Paul's first impulse was to pause and look into it, both out of civic duty and human decency. Documenting the situation and reporting it to authorities may be essential to solving what was clearly a very violent crime, as this was proof of a crime, which seemed highly likely. But Paul was also aware of the potentially hazardous circumstances he found himself in as a lone motorist on a remote section of roadway early in the morning hours. Human remains may still be in the vicinity. If they were being aggressively disposed of here, Paul might run the danger of running into whoever was behind this gory spectacle if he stopped. Paul was also well aware of the potential legal ramifications of being implicated in a criminal investigation because he worked as a commercial truck driver, especially one that pertaining to a murder. Unauthorized stops and delays that could impact delivery timetables were strictly prohibited by his company's standards. Paul had to decide to keep driving while he thought about what he could do. He took note of the precise position of mile marker 352. He observed it about 7 p.m. bound Interstate 90. Additionally, he turned on his dash camera system to get a GPS timestamp that would support his story if necessary in the future. The position of the camera and the darkness, however, probably prevented it from getting a good picture of the remains. Paul grappled for the next 20 meters with the ethical and practical ramifications of what he had seen. The logical side of his brain demanded that he notify the police of this discovery right away. The evidence of the murder and dismemberment of a human person was reportedly being disposed of on public roads. Each minute without a police presence was time that may allow the murderer to get away with it or to destroy further evidence. Paul was aware of the realities of his circumstances as a long-haul truck driver, though. There would probably be substantial delays, missed delivery dates, and possible issues with his employer if he were to testify in a big criminal investigation. Due to the exceedingly strict schedules in the transportation sector, drivers who created delays, even for valid reasons, such as assisting with police investigations, people were frequently disciplined or fired. When Paul arrived at the next truck stop, some 30 miles east of the location of his grisly find, his internal argument was settled. He knew he couldn't live with himself if he didn't report what might if he didn't report what might be important evidence in a murder case, even though there would be professional repercussions. After parking his tractor, he contacted the Montana State Highway Patrol using the payphone at the truck stop, giving them the precise time and place of his observation. At first, the dispatcher who answered Paul's call didn't appear to believe his claim, presumably thinking it was a prank call or an instance of misidentifying animal remains. But after Paul elaborated on the precise dismemberment incisions and the purposeful placement of the body, the dispatcher's tone changed to very seriously. She asked Paul to stay available for any follow-up inquiries and advised him that a police unit would be sent to inspect the scene. While awaiting additional communication from law police, Paul proceeded with his delivery run. After providing his contact information and route instructions, he drove the rest of the trip in a condition of hypervigilance, watching the road for anything else that didn't look right. He could still clearly see the image of that exact torso cut, and it made him wonder who could have carried out such a premeditated act of brutality. Paul was unpacking his shipment in Minneapolis when detectives called him 6 hours later. The bones were found and secured precisely where Paul claimed to have found them, according to the state trooper who contacted him. Paul's conclusion that the torso displayed evidence of intentional dismemberment rather than unintentional injuries was confirmed by preliminary examination conducted at the scene. But the investigator also revealed details that added to the unsettling nature of the scenario. Scavengers had already found the corpses by the time the police team arrived at the scene. It appears that a pack of wolves had been feeding on the torso when the officers arrived, and they had to use spotlights and sirens to get the animals to leave the area. Scavengers' presence made the investigation much more difficult. The feeding animals may have scattered or destroyed important evidence. More significantly, Paul might have been in direct competition with a pack of ravenous wolves for what they thought was a meal, for he had taken the time to look into the remains when he first spotted them. Paul was glad he had decided to keep driving when he considered the possibility of being stranded in the pre-dawn darkness of a distant highway between untamed animals and possible human killers. More unsettling information would come to light during the subsequent Gestapo probe. Eventually, it was determined that the torso belonged to a 34-year-old vagrant who had vanished from a tiny village approximately 200 meters distant. The dismemberment's accuracy indicated that the person had anatomical understanding, potentially medical or training in veterinary medicine. The bones were disposed of in a remote spot, suggesting familiarity with the area and traffic patterns on the roadway. The investigators' discovery that this wasn't an isolated incident was the most terrifying of all. Similar findings have been made along isolated sections of interstate routes in Montana, North Dakota, and Minnesota within the last 2 years. In each instance, carefully dismembered human remains had been discovered in areas that indicated meticulous preparation and familiarity with traffic patterns and police patrol schedules. Paul discovered that he might have seen proof of an active serial killer who was disposing of victims via the interstate highway system. The murderer seemed to be going after fugitives whose disappearances might not be noticed or looked into right away. The meticulous dismemberment and cautious disposal techniques pointed to a systematic, well-organized individual who was likely to keep killing until caught. Paul continued to testify and collaborate with FBI profilers who sought to comprehend the killer's tactics and mental state during the months-long inquiry. However, no arrests were made in relation to the crime, despite a thorough investigation and coordination between several law enforcement authorities. Investigators believed that Paul's discovery on Interstate 90 would eventually be part of a bigger pattern of evidence that would help them identify and apprehend the perpetrator. However, the case was very difficult to investigate because of the isolated sites, meticulous disposal techniques, and seemingly random victim selection. The murderer seems to know how to take advantage of the size and remoteness of the American highway system in order to carry out crimes and get rid of evidence with little chance of being caught. Paul's viewpoint on long-distance trucking and highway travel in general was drastically altered by the event. he became considerably more cautious about stopping in distant areas and much more mindful of the possibility of illegal activities there. Additionally, he gained a greater understanding of the function that truck drivers and other highway users play as unofficial defenders of the interstate system, frequently acting as the sole witnesses to crimes that occur in places too far away for a frequent police presence. Paul continues to travel the same roads through Montana and the Dakotas years later, but he's on the lookout for any indications of criminal activity or anything else that doesn't seem right. He's aware that a systematic murderer may still be using the American roadways as a place to hunt and dispose of bodies. The idea that he might one day come across new proof of these crimes keeps him vigilant and serves as a reminder that the desolate sections of the interstate highway might conceal secrets far more unsettling than mere roadkill. The case is still open, listed among the increasing number of offenses using highways that make it difficult for law enforcement to conduct efficient investigations over large geographic areas. Paul is forever reminded that evil can arise in the most unlikely places by the recollection of that same mutilated torso. When you get close enough to see the awful truth, sometimes the most disturbing discoveries are the ones that appear almost typical. Let's proceed to the seventh tale. Throughout his 23 years with the Kansas City Police Department, Detective Frank Turner had looked into hundreds of murders, but nothing had prepared him for the systematic terror that would engulf America's heartland in the spring of 1992. What started out as a single incident in Indianapolis would turn into one of the most horrifying, unsolved serial killing sprees in American history, spanning 5 states and giving investigators a profile of a murderer whose crimes stood in stark contrast to the usual pattern of serial murders. The murderous rampage started at a Payless shoe store in Indianapolis, Indiana, on April 8, 1992. In the back room of the business, 26-year-old Mother Robin Fulower, who was working as an assistant manager, was discovered shot execution style. The murderer reportedly broke into the store during regular business hours, pushed Rob into the back of the structure, and used a .22 caliber gun to shoot her once in the head. There was no theft of cash from the register. No evidence of sexual assault was found, and items were stolen, with almost no physical evidence left behind. The murder seemed to have been committed with clinical precision and without apparent reason. Investigators found Robin's murder especially unsettling, since it seemed so random. Her personal circumstances would not have made, because the store was in a crowded mall, the murderer would have run the danger of being noticed by many people. However, it appears that he entered during the day, killed someone, and left without raising any red flags with other customers or nearby establishments. 3 days later, on April 11th, the second attack took place in Wichita, Kansas, which is about 500 miles away from the crime scene in Indianapolis. Patricia Smith and Patricia Maggers, both 32, 23, were both working at an unpaid shoe store when the murderer used the same technique to do another murder. In the back area of the store, both women were discovered shot in the head with a .22 caliber firearm. Once more, no cash was stolen, no goods were taken, and the killings seemed to have no obvious reason other than the murderer's apparent need to kill innocent individuals in the middle of the day. The developing pattern frightened law enforcement officials throughout the Midwest. Retail employees, particularly brunette women who worked in shoe stores, were being routinely targeted by someone who used the same weapon and method to kill them. It was either extraordinary luck or a deep awareness of how to evade monitoring and witnesses that allowed the assassin to enter crowded retail places during business hours, commit murder, and then flee undetected. The person tasked with organizing the multi-state probe, Frank Turner, realized that the kind of serial killer they were dealing with was unparalleled. This killer was traveling great distances and striking with startling regularity, in contrast to other serial killers who worked in well-known areas with cooling-off periods in between assaults. The crime's geographic spread indicated that the perpetrator was either on the road for work or didn't have a permanent address, which made it very challenging to use conventional investigation techniques. The third attack occurred at Terre Haute, Indiana, on April 27, 1992. At a Payless shoe store, 37-year-old Sarah Blessing was working alone when the murderer went in and pushed her into the rear room. The same .22 caliber gun used in the earlier killings was found to have shot her once in the head. Around the time of the murder, witnesses in surrounding establishments claimed to have seen a man of ordinary height and build leave the shoe store, but their accounts were too vague to be helpful in identifying the perpetrator. The chronology of Sarah's murder was especially unsettling. After assaulting him, which on April 11th, the murderer waited more than 2 weeks before launching another attack in Terret. This implied a degree of restraint and preparation that ran counter to the victim's selections, seeming spontaneity. The murderer wasn't acting out of sudden opportunity or unbridled wrath. He was meticulously organizing every assault, while keeping his composure to evade notice in between offenses. Unsettling information on the killer's chosen criteria came to light during the investigation. During the day, the 3 victims were all brunette women who worked alone in shoe stores without pay. Since all of the establishments were in crowded malls, the murderer could blend in with the regular flow of customers. Every murder had been carried out in the store's rear room, away from windows that could be used to observe the crime from the outside. Frank Turner started creating a profile of a person involved in reconnaissance before to any assault. To carry out such exact crimes without being discovered, the murderer needed to be familiar with the store's layouts, the victim's work schedules, and the periods of high customer activity. This implied that either the individual had prior retail expertise or was devoting a substantial amount of time to monitoring before to every homicide. On May 3, 1992, the 4th attack took place near St. Charles, Missouri, close outside Louis. In the rear of yet another Payless shoe business, 24-year-old Nancy Kitson Miller was discovered shot in the head. There was just one .22 caliber bullet found at the Missouri crime scene. No signs of robbery or sexual assault, and no tangible evidence that could be used to identify the perpetrator, the murderer. The St. Charles murder reinforced Frank's greatest worries regarding the geographical extent of the probe. At this point, the murderer was active in an area that stretched more than 400 miles from Kansas to Indiana to Missouri. It was becoming difficult to locate someone who might attack any place in such a large area and then vanish using traditional police coordination techniques, entirely in between assaults. When FBI behavioral experts gave a terrifying evaluation of the killer's mentality, the probe gained fresh immediacy. The killer's obvious enjoyment in focusing on particular victim categories and the accuracy of the killings pointed to a person who was likely to keep killing until they were stopped by the police or died. The rest intervals in between assaults could be shorter as the murderer improved his techniques and grew more self-assured. The murderer returned to Raytown, Missouri, which is less than 20 miles from Kansas City, on May 7, 1992, when Julie Reiter, 25, was discovered shot in the head at her Payless shoe boutique. She became the 5th victim. Due to the murder's close proximity to Frank's jurisdiction, the multi-state inquiry would be primarily coordinated by the Kansas City Police Department. The most precise evidence found thus far came from the Raytown crime site. Around the time of Julie's murder, a guy was seen leaving the shopping center on video from nearby companies' security cameras. A Caucasian man of average height was seen in the video and constructing informal attire that wouldn't draw attention in a store. However, the image quality wasn't sufficient for facial recognition or positive identification. The series' last verified incident took place in Bloomington, Indiana, on May 27, 1992. In another crowded mall, Victoria Scheller, 37, was discovered shot in the head at a Payless shoe store. The 3-week interval between Raytown and the Bloomington murders raised the possibility that the murderer was writing or adhering to a set routine that investigators were unable to foresee. In the end, Frank Turner's investigation produced evidence that connected the same .22 caliber pistol to at least 6 killings in 5 different states. A single perpetrator was unquestionably responsible for the entire rampage. The ballistics testing revealed that all of the victims had been killed by bullets fired from the same gun. But even after a thorough inspection, his suspect was ever found or taken into custody, despite the involvement of numerous police departments, the FBI, and other state law enforcement organizations. One of the most difficult unresolved cases in Frank's career was the AI-70 murderer case, so dubbed because of the interstate highway that connected numerous of the crime places. Either remarkable criminal acumen or amazing luck was required for the killer to operate over such a large geographic area, while retaining immaculate operational security. Questions were raised regarding whether the murderer had died, been imprisoned for other crimes, or had just relocated to a different area where his murders weren't being linked to the 70 series. After the killing spree ended abruptly in May 1992, investigators pursued hundreds of leads and spoke with thousands of possible witnesses during the case's years-long existence. In 2010, Frank Turner left the Kansas City Police Department. However, he couldn't help but think of the 6 women who had been killed by an apparently vanish like a ghost, leaving only his victims' distraught families and ballistic proof in their wake. The case of the I-70 killer serves as evidence of how a systematic, mobile serial killer can take advantage of the communication and jurisdictional barriers that occasionally impede multi-state investigations. In addition to being an unsolved mystery, the case served as a chilling reminder to Frank Turner and the other detectives that some criminals are so intelligent and well-behaved that they are able to commit flawless crimes, leaving law enforcement with proof of their deeds, but no way to bring them to justice. Let's go on to the 9th tale. Despite spending hours each day negotiating the increasingly crowded streets of the city, Bruce Jordan had always taken pleasure in being a cautious driver who kept safe following distances, utilized turn signals religiously, and never allowed road rage to get the better of him. Atlanta suburbs. He was 35 years old and an insurance adjuster, so he had direct experience with the devastation caused by reckless driving and traffic accidents. When he drove with his family, especially his 6-year-old daughter Emma, who sat in the back seat on their weekend errands and family outings, he was especially cautious because of his professional awareness. In August, on this specific Saturday afternoon 2018, Bruce was on his way back from Emma's soccer practice with his daughter securely fastened in her booster seat, talking animatedly about the goals she had nearly scored and the ice cream he had promised her if she continued honing her footwork. Through a combination of residential streets and busier main highways that connected the many suburbs extending north of Atlanta, the travel from the sports complex to their neighborhood usually took 15 minutes or less. The event started as these circumstances frequently include something utterly trivial and forgettable. Bruce saw a pickup vehicle coming from his left at what appeared to be a hazardous speed as he was approaching a stop sign controlled 4-way intersection. Bruce chose to avoid the collision by driving through the intersection at his usual speed. Bruce decided to hold off on moving forward for a few more seconds to be sure the other motorist had completely stopped. This minor defensive driving maneuver reportedly infuriated the driver of the pickup truck. A middle-aged man with shoulder-length hair started making angry gestures through his glass and blasting his horn. Bruce didn't know what had caused such a negative reaction to what he saw as basic traffic safety, but he decided to disregard the other driver's actions and keep driving home in the hopes that things would settle down on their own. The pickup truck driver, regrettably, was not going to ignore the perceived slight. Bruce saw in his rearview mirror that the pickup was following him as he crossed the junction and went down the quiet street. The pickup was keeping an uncomfortable following distance as the driver was still making gestures and loudly shouting inside his car. Bruce's initial reaction was to take a detour home in order to avoid having to lead an irate visitor to his family's home. in the hopes that the other motorist would lose interest and go on. He took a number of pointless turns in the subdivision. Just moments before, Emma had been talking excitedly about her soccer practice when she started to notice her father's strained demeanor and the aggressive driving of the car behind them. "Why is that man following us, Daddy?" Bruce tried to keep his cool for his daughter's sake while he considered his options. He could drive to the closest police station, but that would mean exposing Emma to this volatile situation far longer. Emma asked from the back seat, her voice carrying the worrying that children develop when they sense their parents are stressed or frightened. He could stop in a public spot and hope the other driver would just go by. But there was no assurance that this would put an end to the altercation, and more worrying of all was the potential that this was the start of a spiraling situation that might actually endanger Emma. As the pursuit went on, the pickup truck driver's actions became more and more unpredictable. After several minutes of this terrifying pursuit through residential streets, Bruce decided to drive to a nearby shopping center, where he hoped the presence of other people might deter the aggressive driver from escalating the situation further. He started tailgating Bruce's vehicle so closely that a collision seemed inevitable if Bruce had to brake suddenly. The man was clearly visible in Bruce's mirrors, gesticulating wildly and apparently screaming, though the closed windows prevented any actual communication about what had triggered his rage. The shopping center was crowded with weekend traffic, and Bruce believed that witnesses could either prevent violence or be able to call for assistance if things got out of hand. Bruce pulled into the parking lot and parked close to the main entrance so that other customers and store employees could see him the best. He hoped that this would be the end of the altercation, that the pickup driver would understand how instead what transpired would traumatize Emma for years to come and drastically alter Bruce's perception of how easily ordinary circumstances could turn deadly. The pickup truck pulled into the parking space right next to Bruce's car, and the driver got out and started walking toward Bruce's car. Bruce's perception of what transpired next was unbelievable, and the man, who was carrying what looked like a full-sized fire axe in both hands as he approached Bruce's car with clearly hostile intent, instantly turned what had been a traffic dispute into a life-threatening situation. Bruce's mind raced as he attempted to comprehend the unbelievable nature of what was happening. It seemed that someone had been driving around suburban Atlanta with an axe in Daddy. "What is that man doing?" Emma asked from the back seat, her voice now tight with fear as she saw the approaching figure with the axe. Bruce's paternal instincts kicked in with overwhelming force. Their car, ready to use it as a weapon in response to minor traffic disagreements. The premeditated nature of carrying such a weapon suggested this wasn't the man's first violent confrontation, and Bruce realized with growing horror that he and Emma had stumbled into an encounter with someone who was actually dangerous and possibly unstable. When the man with the axe continued to approach, Bruce quickly weighed his options. He could try to drive away, but the man was now close enough to the car that a sudden movement might provoke an immediate attack. He could get out and try to reason with the man, but that would leave Emma alone in the car and expose Bruce to possible injury or death. Regardless, he had to protect his daughter from both physical harm and psychological trauma. When the man with the axe arrived at Bruce's car, he started to try to open the driver's side door while yelling obscenities and threats that Bruce couldn't fully comprehend through the closed windows. And when he discovered the door locked, he raised the axe as though he was going to smash the window, sending glass shards flying toward Emma in the back seat. Bruce made a split-second decision in that moment of complete terror that most likely saved both of their lives. The man with the axe had to jump backward to avoid being struck by the moving car, so he threw the car into reverse and backed out of the parking space as fast as he could, and Bruce then put the car in drive and sped toward the parking lot exit, leaving the dangerous stranger standing among the parked cars with his weapon. And as they left the shopping center, Bruce noticed in his rearview mirror that the man was back in his pickup truck. Police responded quickly and professionally, taking detailed statements from Bruce and Emma. though they were careful to limit the 6-year-old's exposure to the more disturbing aspects of the incident. Bruce drove straight to the closest police station, apparently intending to continue the pursuit. Calling 911 on his cell phone, he drove to report the incident and request immediate assistance. The shopping center security cameras had recorded parts of the confrontation, providing video. The pickup truck's license plate had been partially obscured by mud or intentional tampering, making vehicle identification impossible. The man's appearance was generic enough that he couldn't be positively identified from security footage or witness descriptions, and there was clear video footage and multiple witness accounts. But the axe-wielding attacker was never found or arrested. Emma, who had been undergoing cancer treatment earlier in her life, later told counselors that the road rage incident was more terrifying than any of her medical procedures, and the random, senseless nature of the violence was too much for her 6-year-old mind to process, resulting in months of nightmares and anxiety about car rides. The incident left both Bruce and Emma with long-lasting psychological scars. Bruce installed a dash cam in his car and started carrying pepper spray because he was always watching over his shoulder while driving and worried that the next small traffic incident might turn into another life-threatening situation. Although he knew that these precautions would not protect him from someone who was willing to use an axe, the case became part of Bruce's experience was unique only in the weapon used. Police reported multiple instances of drivers threatening each other with firearms, knives, and improvised weapons. The anonymity offered by cars, coupled with the stress of urban traffic and the easy availability of weapons, was creating a perfect storm for violent confrontations between strangers. The Atlanta area police were keeping an increasingly concerned eye on a growing file of road rage incidents. Emma, now a teenager, has spoken out about the incident as part of anti-bullying and violence prevention programs, saying it taught her that some people carry anger and violence with them everywhere they go, waiting for an excuse to unleash it on innocent victims. For Emma, the memory of that terrifying afternoon serves as a permanent reminder of how quickly normal life can turn dangerous. Bruce never found out what had caused such a severe reaction to a routine traffic encounter. Maybe the man had been dealing with personal issues unrelated to Bruce's cautious driving. Maybe he had a history of substance abuse or mental illness that made him prone to violent outbursts. Or maybe he was just someone who had. Bruce and Emma's routine drive home from soccer practice turned into a brush with deadly violence that altered their perspective on personal safety and the possibility that evil can manifest in the most ordinary situations. Regardless of the underlying cause, the incident remains a chilling example of how road rage can escalate beyond verbal confrontation or reckless driving into genuine terrorism. He had access to deadly weapons and never learned to control his temper. A 6-year-old girl who had already battled cancer saw the axe that stranger carried that day as more than just a tool or weapon. It was a symbol of the anger and violence that can lurk beneath the surface of ordinary interactions, waiting for the smallest trigger to explode into life-threatening confrontation. Let's move on to the 10th story. Detective Diana had been working missing persons cases for the California Highway Patrol for more than 12 years, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for the statistical anomaly that would define the most disturbing case of her career. It started in March 2020, when her supervisor handed her a thick file, one against the unpredictable darkness that can emerge from the hearts of strangers sharing the same roads and spaces we all navigate in our daily lives, containing information compiled by the National Missing and Unidentified Person, and a request to look into what seemed to be an impossible pattern of disappearances along one of the most picturesque highways in America. The Pacific Coast Highway, officially known as State Route 1, is a 655-mile route that runs along the California coastline from Dana Point in Orange County to Leatt in Mendocino County. It is known for its stunning scenery. Highway 1 is one of the most popular scenic routes in the United States, drawing millions of tourists each year with its ocean views, dramatic cliffs, and access to some of the world's most beautiful beaches. Tourism officials marketed Highway 1 as the ultimate road trip destination, a ribbon of asphalt that connected charming coastal communities and offered unmatched access to California's natural beauty. However, what the brochures failed to mention, and what Diana found in those first few pages of the file, was that the Pacific additionally Coast Highway had a more sinister distinction. From 2005 to 2020, 140 people went missing along Highway 1, more than any other road in America, according to federal data compiled over the previous 15 years. The numbers were startling and defied any plausible explanation based on traffic volume, accident rates, or typical missing person statistics. Diana's first reaction was skepticism. Missing person statistics could be misleading when they didn't account for variables like population density. So these were not cases of people getting lost while hiking in nearby wilderness areas or drowning at nearby beaches, but rather people who had been documented as traveling on or near Highway 1 and who had then vanished without leaving any trace of their whereabouts, their vehicles, or their ultimate fate. The demographic profile of the missing people was remarkably consistent and deeply troubling, and as she dug deeper into the data, patterns that could not be explained by conventional factors emerged, suggesting something far more disturbing was happening along California's most beautiful highway. Tourism volume, or the tendency for people to engage in risky behaviors while on vacation. The remaining 15 cases involved women and older men, but even these outliers fell within a broader age range of 25 to 40 years old. Diana spent weeks examining the individual case files, searching for connections beyond the basic demographic. Of the total cases, 127 involved males between the ages of 28 and 35, representing nearly 90% of all cases, a statistical concentration that was nearly impossible to explain through random chance or typical missing person patterns. Even more unsettling than the age and gender trends, she discovered that most of the missing had been traveling alone, frequently on road trips or vacation drives along the picturesque highway, and that many of them had been photographed at restaurants, gas stations, or tourist attractions along Highway 1 just hours or days before they were reported missing. The disappearances were particularly disturbing in their geographic distribution, as they seemed to occur equally frequently along the entire highway, rather than being concentrated in isolated or dangerous areas. Cases had been reported from the urbanized areas near Los Angeles to the isolated stretches near Big Sur and beyond, suggesting that whatever was causing these disappearances wasn't limited to. A troubling pattern surfaced from this analysis. Many of the missing persons had made their last confirmed contacts, phone calls, text messages, or social media posts from specific areas along Highway 1, which recurred repeatedly in the case. Diana started building detailed timeline reconstructions for each case, attempting to identify the last known locations and activities of the missing individuals. Files. One particularly concerning group of disappearances involved the vicinity of Hearst Castle, the well-known tourist destination constructed by newspaper tycoon William Rand Hearst between 2008 and 2018. -1 distinct people had disappeared after visiting or indicating plans to visit the castle. Their cars were discovered parked in lots along Highway 1, frequently with personal items still inside, but the passengers themselves had just 11 people had gone missing in the Big Sur region over the course of the 15-year period, including a group of 3 friends whose abandoned campsite was found intact, complete with food still cooking over a camp stove, when park rangers discovered it 3 days after the men's scheduled return. Another concentration of cases occurred near the Big Sur region, where the highway winds through some of the most remote and dramatically beautiful coastline in California. The fact that so many capable, competent adults could just disappear without explanation challenged every presumption. Diana's investigation showed that many of the missing people had been seasoned travelers or outdoor enthusiasts who would not have been likely to get lost or be involved in accidents under normal circumstances. Some of them were military veterans with survival training, while others were professional drivers or tour guides who knew the highway well. When the cars of missing persons were recovered, they were usually found in perfect condition with no indications of struggle, mechanical failure, or accident damage, and personal belongings, such as wallets, phones, and other items, were typically undisturbed. Diana had a lot of cases involving missing persons, and the vehicle evidence was especially perplexing, and valuables that would typically be the target of robbery. The cars were frequently discovered in places that didn't make sense, either left in tourist areas when the missing people had no known reason to be there, or abandoned in far-flung parking lots, miles from where they had last been seen. Diana started speaking with the missing people's friends and family. A number of families reported receiving phone calls from their missing relatives in the days after their disappearances, but the calls were from the missing person's own cell phones and contained only static breathing sounds or voices that family members couldn't positively identify as their loved ones. She was hoping to find common factors or shared experiences that might explain the disappearances, but instead she found a series of disturbing accounts that seemed to defy rational explanation. In 3 different cases, people who fit the physical descriptions of missing persons had shown up at their families' homes weeks or months after their disappearances, but their behavior persuaded family members that these were not, in fact, their missing loved ones. These imposters appear to have detailed knowledge about the missing person's lives and relationships, but they also displayed personality changes, so that it was even more unsettling for the families to report strange encounters with people claiming to be their missing relatives. Dramatic that families didn't believe them to be real. Diana's investigation grew to include interviews with local law enforcement officials, park rangers, and business owners along Highway 1, which revealed a picture of a highway community that had grown accustomed to mysterious disappearances and had established informal procedures for handling them. Several business owners along the highway reported incidents involving customers who initially appeared normal but then displayed increasingly strange behavior during their visits, asking unusual questions about local geography, and gas station attendants reported frequent visits from people searching for missing family members. Hotel and restaurant employees also reported encounters with guests who seemed disoriented or claimed to be traveling to destinations that didn't exist. The most chilling accounts came from park rangers and emergency responders who had been involved in search and rescue operations for missing Highway 1 travelers. These odd customers had paid for goods or services with courtesy that looked authentic but bore serial numbers or design elements that didn't match any known US currency. They made references to places or events that didn't correspond with reality, or showed knowledge of the area that seemed impossible given their claimed origins. Diana's research revealed that the disappearance pattern along Highway 1 wasn't entirely modern, as evidence of campsites or temporary shelters in remote areas that seemed to have been occupied recently but contained no trace of their inhabitants was found. These sites frequently featured personal belongings that matched descriptions of items belonging to missing persons, but the belongings were arranged in ways that suggested deliberate placement rather than abandonment during an emergency. Native American oral histories from the area included stories about areas along the coast where people would vanish inexplicably, never to be seen again, and Spanish colonial records from the 18th and 19th centuries contained accounts of travelers who disappeared while following coastal trails that roughly paralleled the current highway route. Historical records from the early 20th century also documented similar unexplained vanishings along the coastal route. Even before the modern highway existed, the investigation reached a turning point. Working with federal agencies and telecommunications companies, Diana started analyzing cell phone data from the missing. By tracking the phone's connections to cell towers along Highway 1, she was able to determine the final known locations of numerous missing people. What she found was a pattern that defied technological explanation. In many cases, the phones of the missing had been registering location data 4 days or weeks after their disappearances, but the locations were impossible. Phones were registering positions that would have required them to be suspended in midair over the ocean or hundreds of feet underground, or they were showing connections to cell towers in places where no towers existed. The concentration of disappearances along Highway 1, the consistent demographic patterns, the impossibility of so many competent adults vanishing without trace, and the technological anomalies all pointed to something unprecedented in law enforcement experience. Diana's final report to our supervisors documented a mystery that challenged conventional understanding of missing person cases and suggested the possibility of factors beyond normal criminal or accidental explanations. It seemed to be moving at speeds that would have been impossible for ground-based travel, suggesting either equipment malfunctions or movement patterns that violated known physics, with each new case adding to the statistical impossibility of the pattern and offering no new insights into what might be causing these vanishings. Diana's investigation of new disappearances along Highway 1 continues to be officially open, and the Pacific Coast Highway has changed from California's most beautiful drive to America's most dangerous mystery. The 140 documented disappearances are more than just statistics. They represent families destroyed, lives disrupted, and questions that may never be answered. For Diana, each case file contains not only information about the disappearances, but also a place where the line between the explainable and the impossible seems to blur like fog rolling in from the Pacific Ocean. From the Pacific Ocean. Here's our 11th story. Tyler and Bobby had been best friends since college, bonded over their shared love of adventure and their willingness to take risks that their more cautious classmates avoided. It's not just data, but the story of someone who set out to experience the beauty of California's coast and instead encountered something that removed them from the world entirely, leaving behind only the echo of their absence and the growing certainty that Highway 1 holds secrets that may be too disturbing for rational minds to fully comprehend. Both men were 29 years old, had demanding jobs in the tech sector in Seattle, and their monthly weekend getaways into the Pacific Northwest wilderness felt like much-needed therapy for their overworked brains. They had camped in designated areas throughout Washington and Oregon, hiked most of the major trails within driving distance of the city, and thought of themselves as seasoned outdoor enthusiasts capable of handling whatever nature threw at them. On this Friday evening in October, Tyler's plan was straightforward. Drive east toward the Cascade Mountains, find some interesting back roads to explore, and spend the weekend camping in places that weren't crowded with tourists or casual hikers. Tyler picked Bobby up his modified Jeep Wrangler in 2021, a vehicle he'd specially equipped for off-road adventures with reinforced bumpers, all-terrain tires, and recovery equipment that had gotten them out of difficult situations during previous expeditions. Using satellite imagery and topographic maps, Bobby had identified a number of promising locations, locating Forest Service roads that seemed to lead to isolated valleys where they could camp away from established campgrounds. Both men were accustomed to primitive camping and had everything they would need for a comfortable weekend in the wilderness, including emergency communication devices, water purification equipment, and plenty of food. The drive started off normally, with Tyler driving the well-traveled highways away from Seattle, while Bobby acted as they had made similar trips dozens of times before, always returning on Sunday evening with tales of breathtaking scenery, strenuous hiking trails, and the kind of quiet seclusion that was unattainable in their urban everyday lives. It was getting close to sunset when they turned off the main highway onto a Forest Service road that Bobby had noted on his maps. The navigator used GPS coordinates and paper maps to help them reach their destination. They found their first indication that something might be amiss about 12 miles from the highway when Tyler's GPS unit, which had been providing dependable navigation throughout the trip, suddenly lost satellite signal despite the clear sky visible through breaks in the forest canopy. The road was unpaved, but well maintained, winding through dense stands of Douglas fir and western hemlock that blocked most of the fading daylight. As the road became steeper and more difficult, Tyler engaged the Jeep's four-wheel drive system. The road continued to climb steadily through the forest, occasionally providing glimpses of distant peaks through the trees, but otherwise maintaining the same character of dense woodland on both sides. Bobby checked his phone and found that he had no cellular service, which was disappointing, as they had hoped to share some photos of their adventure on social media, but not unusual in remote mountain areas. It was estimated that they had been about 18 miles from the highway when they crested a small ridge and looked down into a valley that was completely covered in fog, obscuring everything below the ridgeline where they had stopped. The fog was oddly uniform and dense, and it didn't match anything they had seen on their maps or satellite images. Tyler pulled the Jeep to a stop on a small turnout overlooking the fog-filled valley, and both men got out to assess the situation. The fog looked more like a solid white surface than a normal weather phenomenon, and neither Tyler nor Bobby had ever seen fog that looked so artificial, as if someone had filled the valley with cotton batting instead of natural moisture condensation. There was complete silence, with no sounds of insects, birds, or wind through the trees. Bobby looked at his topographic maps, but the valley below didn't match any of the geographical features on the charts. "This doesn't make sense," Bobby said, spreading the map across the Jeep's hood, "because we should be looking at a gradual slope down to a creek bed, not a valley filled with fog." Even their own voices sounded muffled and distant when they spoke to each other. "And look at this, no valley this huge exists any place in this region." Tyler studied the maps, looking down at the impossibility of the image, and noticed that the fog was not shifting or moving as it should. Tyler put the Jeep in its lowest gear range and started the cautious descent down a road that appeared to lead directly into the valley to investigate. Despite their better judgment, encouraged by curiosity and the confidence that came from years of successful wilderness adventures, and the most unsettling of all was the way their headlights seemed to be absorbed by the white mist rather than reflecting back as they should have. The fog was thicker than either man had ever encountered, lowering visibility to less than 3 feet in any direction, and Tyler had to stop the Jeep several times to avoid driving off what might have been cliffs or into obstacles they couldn't see until they were almost touching them. As they entered the forebank, the surroundings changed in ways that were inexplicable. Their voices, when they tried to communicate, seemed to be absorbed by the mist before reaching each other's ears, despite sitting just feet apart in the Jeep's cabin. What was more unsettling than the poor visibility was the way the fog seemed to muffle all sound. Tyler's diesel engine, which is normally loud enough to be heard 4 miles in mountain terrain, became a whisper. His altimeter, which had been working flawlessly during their ascent to the ridge, now showed readings that fluctuated impossibly, showing them alternately hundreds of feet above and below sea level within seconds, and the road beneath them, which had been clearly defined dirt and gravel, became harder to follow as Bobby tried to use his compass to keep their sense of direction. But the device started spinning wildly, unable to locate magnetic north. Several times, Tyler stopped the Jeep when the path ahead seemed to completely disappear, forcing them to back up and try alternate routes that appeared and vanished in the shifting mist. Tyler had to guess the route, following what seemed to be the most logical path through the fog, while hoping they weren't getting hopelessly lost. Tyler and Bobby realized they had lost all sense of direction, time, and location after what seemed like hours of moving at walking speed through the fog. Tyler's watch had stopped working, showing the same time it had shown when they first entered the fog. Bobby's digital devices were malfunctioning, either displaying blank screens or impossible readings, and most frightening of all, they were unable to find their way back to the ridge where they had entered the valley. Tyler decided to stop the Jeep and wait for the fog to clear naturally, figuring it was a transitory weather phenomenon that would dissipate with changing atmospheric conditions. But every attempt to retrace their routes only led them farther into the fog, as if the landscape itself was changing around them, the road they had followed down into the valley seemingly gone. replaced by paths that led in directions that made no geographical sense. The fog appeared to be impairing their ability to think clearly, and as the hours went by with no change in the fog's density or their circumstances, both men started to feel a panic that went beyond simple worrying about getting lost. Bobby occasionally lost basic information, his phone number, his address, and even his last name. And Tyler also experienced similar cognitive disruption, losing track of conversations mid-sentence and finding even more unsettling were the sounds that started to come from the fog surrounding them, voices that sounded as though they were calling their names, but from impossibly far and impossible directions, footsteps that circled their parked car without ever identifying the people making them, and the sound of other people when Bobby opened the door of the Jeep to investigate one of the phantom sounds cars passing by, complete with tire and engine noises. But no lights or real presence. They could detect the fog instantly started pouring into the interior of the vehicle like a living thing, flowing around his legs and producing pressure-like sensations. Tyler had to physically pull Bobby back into the Jeep and shut the door to prevent the fog from filling their last remaining area of relative safety. And the movement felt decidedly out of place. The psychological strain of their predicament increased as both men realized they were totally isolated from the outside world, and their emergency communication devices were not working. Tyler made the desperate decision to completely forsake the established path, attempting to climb straight up what he hoped was the side of the valley, using the Jeep's four-wheel drive capabilities to scale terrain that would normally be considered impassable. However, every direction they traveled seemed to be downhill, as if the valley were inaccessible. Their GPS units showed no satellite connection, and their attempts to drive out of the fog only led them deeper into terrain that shouldn't have existed according to any maps or their prior knowledge of the area. Then, in a flash of insight that broke through the fog's apparent hold on their thoughts, Bobby remembered a survival tactic they'd learned in wilderness training and started making noise, shouting, banging on the outside of the Jeep, and honking the horn in regular patterns not to attract attention to stop them from escaping. The sounds Bobby produced were reflecting off surfaces in directions that defied the topography they could see. Echoes were coming from below when they were supposed to be at the bottom of the valley, and from above when they should have been bouncing off valley walls. This technique revealed something impossible about their surroundings, rescue, but to create acoustic landmarks that might help them navigate by sound reflection, were in an area that defied standard three-dimensional geometry, and Tyler used this acoustic information to direct their escape attempt, so that instead of depending on visual cues that were rendered unreliable by the fog, they drove toward areas where the sound reflections suggested open space, which led them up an impossible steep incline that felt more like driving up a wall than climbing a normal slope, but ultimately brought them to a ridge where, almost as quickly, the fog ended as it had started. They exited the fog bank to arrive at a crest that was entirely different from the one they had used to enter the valley in a region not depicted on any of their maps. Tyler's GPS device right away re-established a satellite connection, displaying their position as 12 miles east of where they were when they stepped into the mists, a distance that could not have been accomplished considering the quantity of the terrain they had traversed and the fuel they had consumed. The watches of both men had returned to normal operation, but displayed a time that suggested they had spent more than 18 hours, even though their subjective perception was just 3 to 4 hours had gone by. According to Bobby's equipment measurements, they had inexplicably increased their elevation by about 2,000 feet, while feeling as though things had been going downward all along. The return trip to Seattle was completed. As Tyler and Bobby attempted to comprehend what they had witnessed, there was a startled hush, despite their efforts to find it. Neither man was able to provide a sufficient explanation for what had transpired in that foggy valley. Once more, employing satellite pictures and GPS locations was ineffective. They could discover no aerial photos or maps that seemed to show the valley. The encounter radically altered both men's perspectives on wilderness exploration and their comprehension of actuality itself. Although they remained friends, they never again went into seclusion woodland regions or made an effort to visit places that weren't fully shown on official maps. The experience of being imprisoned in a location that appeared to exist outside of time and space was a lasting memory, reminder that not all secrets are safe enough to explore. Before we wrap up this horrifying Explore 11 unsettling real-life road trip horror tales, and don't forget to click the subscribe button, then press the alert button, since tales like this serve as a reminder that the world is far stranger and more hazardous than most people think. Share your own in the comments section below. Encounters with inexplicable phenomena or near misses while traveling by car. However, keep in mind that there are some stories that are best not discussed in person. Here are some essential tips to help you be safe when traveling by car on your own. Before visiting isolated locations, always let someone know your precise itinerary and anticipated arrival time. Keep several emergency communication devices on hand, such as satellite communicators that can be used in areas where cell phones malfunction. Never conduct an independent investigation of strange occurrences, and follow your gut when something doesn't feel right. The purpose of that internal alarm system is to keep you alive. Above all, keep in mind that curiosity can be fatal if it diverts you from marked paths and well-maintained roads. Some minds aren't equipped to solve the secrets found in the environment, and you might have to pay more for that expertise than you are willing to. Be careful out there and keep in mind that occasionally the journey that gets you home alive to talk about as the finest.